Who has made a headline for missing 6 of his 8 field goal attempts this year, is now back to just punting and kicking off. The former Saint Morton Anderson is here for most field goals. Look out! Right through! A kick block by Steve Gleason. It is scooped and scored by Curtis DeLoach. Touchdown, New Orleans!
All right, y'all. Welcome back. I have not watched the game tonight, but I'm about to change into my Saints gear here in just a second. But we obviously do know the result of the game. So again, hopefully you watched that last night, and then welcome back this morning. So we're going to move on with the next myth, but you might notice we're skipping myth number 5. We're going straight into 6, really because 5 and 6 have to do with sort of the same things. I want to say that 5 is not all reproductive choices are equal, and that doesn't really concern us as much as perhaps this topic for today and tomorrow does. So right off the bat, I want to just make a few caveats. Okay, much like with cohabitation, I'm not going to be making an argument against premarital sex and any kind of extramarital sex. I'm not going to make any arguments from the sin perspective, like don't do this or else you'll go to hell or what have you, right? I don't know how often that's really effective. I think a lot of times it's taught that way, or really there's 2 errors, right? And this is both from like 2 errors in the religious tradition, right? On the one hand, maybe you go so ultra conservative that you say don't even think about it, don't even acknowledge that you have a sexual instinct or desires. Suppress it, repress it, and any thought, sexual or otherwise, is sinful, right? And so you have like this ultra conservative approach, and you've probably seen, whether it's in movies or what have you, that often ends with like the character that had that kind of upbringing, letting loose and going crazy and sort of a rebellion, right? The other one is, and this is kind of a new error, and this has been probably in the last 10, 15 years or so, people taking John Paul II's theology of the body, which is really, really good, but what happens is that they glorify the sexual aspects of human life to be something other than it's not, or put it this way, they make it seem like that's the end-all be-all of the Christian life, is to have this really robust romantic sexual life, and that's not the case either, right? Like it's not the end-all be-all as well. And that's not what John Paul II had in mind when he wrote the Theology of the Body. So probably a good jumping off point is, what did John Paul II actually mean by the Theology of the Body? And what he meant is this. We have to recognize that we have sexual desires and attractions, and that those are a normative part of what it means to be human. In other words, it's not something to be repressed on like the error that's on this side, right? The error that says you got to repress those and deny that you even have sexual instincts. Okay, it's not that, because we actually have that as a normal human function. We have sexual desires and attractions. Some people are stronger than others, and some people, they are oriented towards good things, and sometimes they're oriented towards not so good things. But the desire and the attraction itself is completely normal and normative, right? On the other hand, John Paul II is saying it's not the end-all be-all. And what has happened a lot of times is that in modern culture, we have made sexual activity the end-all be-all of our entire existence. Think about how many countless movies and TV shows that is the main point, the main goal of the entire character's arc is to either hook up with someone or to maybe marry. That'd be great. But a lot of times, I'm thinking of when I was in high school, the big movie was Superbad. So I don't know if you've seen Superbad or not, but that's the entire plot, right? How do you get alcohol to go to the party to hook up with people? And that's also on the wrong end of things, right? That there is more to life than human sexuality. It's a good thing, but it's not the greatest thing. It's a good thing. It shouldn't be suppressed, but it should be kept in check, right? And I think a lot of times when people try to teach about premarital sex, they get it wrong because they make one of those 2 errors. And usually you're going to hear the error of like, don't have any sexual thoughts because they're all sinful. Well, they're not all sinful. Entertaining them into the realm of lust is sinful, right? But having normal sexual desires in and of itself is not sinful, right? Acting on them outside of marriage is sinful, right? Entertaining them to a point, again, that gets to lust is sinful. but having sexual attractions and desires is not inherently sinful. So why the big deal with premarital sex? I don't know. It's on the one hand, I want to say it's not the biggest deal, right? If you look at Dante's Inferno, the sexual sinners are not in the lowest levels of hell, right? That's for treason traitors, like Judas, right, who betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He is in the lowest level of hell. The sexual sins are in you could say the highest, and not as bad, mostly because they're really easy to fall into. C.S. Lewis says the reason that these are so easy to fall into is that they're the life force sins, right? Food, drink, and sex, right? It's really easy to fall into the life force sins because you need those things to survive, right? You need food and drink to survive, and without sexual activity, the human race would not survive, right? So they're easy to fall into. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we should just say, oh, well, it's not so bad, we'll just give in to that. So I think the reason people make a big deal out of this one is that there's usually coming at it from two perspectives, right? One is that sort of overzealous, conservative, religious viewpoint, whatever that is, that's usually from a misunderstanding of what marriage is, sexuality within marriage, things like that. It's a misunderstanding there. But also I think it's because this is just, it's the most common thought that teenagers and young adults would have, right? Like, this is biologically predetermined in a certain sense that this is what's going on in your life, that these forces are really strong right now. And so that's why it seems to you maybe that we're constantly talking about it. It's not really the case in most theological circles. No one's spending hours and hours on this. The theology is pretty clear here. Okay, let's move on though. That's enough introduction. So we're only going to look at the first 3 parts of the myth today, and we'll look at the other parts tomorrow on Wednesday before we take our break for Easter. So the 3 myths for today are, we're just going to break down what we're going to call these unwritten scripts. And this gets back to, this is what Jennifer and Chris Caxor call it. They call it unwritten scripts. We would call it, again, preconceptions, common mentality. This idea that people follow a certain pattern of behavior without thinking about it beforehand, simply because they believe that's what you're supposed to do. I have a clip here, but a picture of Animal House, right? That you assume that college is supposed to be like Animal House, and therefore you just go ahead and act that out, even though you had complete control of your will to do otherwise, right? And the premarital sex issue comes into this pretty profoundly because people assume that that's what they're supposed to be doing. They assume it's the quote-unquote next step, right? And so they just play out that script without ever actually thinking about it beforehand. And so the myth that the authors point out is this idea that everyone in college is hooking up. And the actual stats on this is that the majority of students in college only hook up once a year. Now, that's still more than the Catholic Church would like. At the same time, it's not as ubiquitous as you might believe from watching something like Animal House, again, something like Superbad, something like any of the National Lampoon movies. You should not go watch any of these. I'm just saying. This is where this idea comes from, right? And another stat that I thought was interesting is that 73% of men regret their hookups within that time period, right? And there's also that unwritten script that if you're a guy, you're supposed to be the quote-unquote player. You'll see in the documentary that we're going to try to watch that there's a lot of talk about that. And just again, being in college myself, I saw things like this where guys, they thought they were supposed to live a certain way, and in living that way, were not finding happiness. They were actually getting deeper and deeper into depression, deeper and deeper into trying to solve their problems through alcohol and things like that. It's not something that you're going to see in the movies, but it's something that plays out in real life. And so, again, we get to the point where you can say, you have one of two options, right? You can say either the objective scientific stats are wrong. How do they even know this? Okay, so it is self-reported, right? They're not following people around. It is self-reported, but it's self-reported anonymously. You get rid of outliers. If you took a sociology class, you realize there are ways to get rid of the outliers and false answers. And so when you get down to it, you get some pretty it's a condemning evidence that people are not enjoying the hookup culture and yet still follow it. And so the question then is why, right? So you can either deny that the stats exist, which would be to deny reality, or you could say that maybe those stats do exist, but it's not going to happen for me. I'm going to follow this script and I'll be fine. And that's always the one that drives me insane. Like, so you're going to deny reality, thinking that somehow it's not going to apply to you, and that to me is not logically doesn't make sense, right? Okay, so let's take a look at the next one. So myth, I don't know, 5.2, whatever you want to call it. I'm pretty sure this is supposed to be 6.2, but only the losers don't do it, right? So only the nerds, the people that were RAs, like myself, those are the ones who aren't involved in this because they're already social outcasts, right? They're not the ones that are going to be partying anyway, and that's where some of these outliers come in, right, or something like that. What's interesting in terms of let's throw out the playbook on what I'm calling a good and happy life, right, which is fulfilling God's vocation and plan for you. Let's throw that out, and let's just say that the best way to have a good life is to make the most money with the highest paying job. Well, if you want that life, you also should not engage in premarital sex, especially in college, because people who abstain from sexual activity in college have a greater socioeconomic upward mobility than people that are constantly hooking up. And so, the stat here, I summarized it in a sentence. College students, graduates obtain a higher or obtain graduation rates higher than people that say hook up more frequently. And what's interesting there, again, is you could say losers is a loose term there. Maybe the reason that people that are abstaining is because they already are antisocial and therefore are more driven academically, what have you. But let's just say, again, throughout the playbook, that you were more interested in making as much money or getting into the best college possible. You don't want to follow this unwritten script then. That's clearly not the argument that we're going to be making, but it's an interesting point. Okay, and then last one for today. And there were two movies that came out about the same exact time. They were very similar. I think this one, I don't know, is Friends with Benefits, and there's another one called No Strings Attached. But the idea being that could you be friends with someone that you were also hooking up with? And I think you've got Justin Timberlake and Mila Kunis or whatever her name is. It's the classic question in any kind of TV show that needs a plot development as well. There's the cohabitation plot, and there's also this, well, maybe we could just be friends plot. It's in Seinfeld. It's in How I Met Your Mother as well. It's a pretty common plot device. But the myth that we're going to really look at is not so much could you be friends with benefits in terms of like that's the main goal. It's actually maybe the opposite. You say you need to have some sort of sexual experience to see if that will then lead to a long-term relationship, right? That I think in most TV shows people talk about the third date. That on the third date is when you engage in those things, and that if you don't find that out early on in the relationship, well, the relationship will go nowhere romantically. And the stats again are pretty condemning to that myth. 8% of hookups result in romantic long-term relationships. So not great. If you were going to say what's the best way to start a long-term relationship, clearly this is not the way to do it. Only 1 in 10 friends with benefits situations, like the movie here, end up in long-term relationships. And the stats, just like with cohabitation, the stats show actually there's an inverse relationship. The earlier the couple engages in sexual activity, the sooner that relationship comes to an end. Now, you can take it for what it's worth, right? You can say, that's fine, Mr. Flores, but those are all a bunch of stats, and you can make stats say anything. And tomorrow we're going to look at some more stats, and you might be skeptical of those as well. But the thing that I really want to draw your attention to is not so much the stats, but what the stats are pointing to, what the stats are hinting at. These don't prove anything, right? Like you could find ways to maybe clarify them or come up with some counterexamples, especially anecdotal counterexamples. But what the stats are hinting at is let's look at the opposite, right? So if only 8% of long-term relationships begin with a hookup, what are the other 92% of long-term relationships beginning with, right? Because clearly something is being successful. This is this unsuccessful. And let's say it's 20%. And then so what are the other 80% doing? If there's an inverse relationship and that early sex leads to an early breakup, well then why is it that delaying sexual activity leads to a greater chance of long-term relationships? And so when you start asking the questions that you say naturally come up when you look at this evidence, you see that what's being hinted at is that the virtues necessary for a successful long-term relationship, right, are not necessarily going to be found in hooking up, right? So think of it maybe in terms of positively. The example that I've usually given is people ask, Mr. Flores, how far is too far, right? Like, where's the line? Maybe we could talk about that more tomorrow. But the idea is, like, if you don't know her name, then you shouldn't be doing anything other than getting to know her name, right? If you don't know her last name, same thing, right? If you know her first and last name and that's about it, maybe the most that you can possibly do is go get a cup of coffee, right? And people don't usually think of it in that terms, right? Especially at parties, you're dancing, you have whatever's in the red Solo cup, and you move on. But real relationships, real love, like we looked at before, requires you'd say, like, nothing good comes quickly, right? You could think of it in terms of, like, even like human life development, right? Like, my daughter's about to turn 2 years old in June. Humans grow at a very, very, very slow rate. We also live quite long, right? Compared to, think of like the mosquito. It's like a 48, 72-hour lifespan. It reaches adulthood pretty quickly. It also dies pretty quickly. Maturity takes a long time in a lot of things, right? Think about even the difference between you guys now at the end of your Jesuit career and the beginning. I teach 8th graders as well, and trust me, you guys are a lot more mature. However immature you actually are, you're a lot more mature than you were when you were in 8th grade. So the same rules apply to a relationship, right? You want maybe the end parts of the relationship, that the intense romantic parts, the true genuine eros parts, but you can't get there right at the beginning. It takes a long time. Now, how long it takes, that is a variable, right? But I think one of the biggest errors in these unwritten scripts is that you want to skip the foundations of your relationship to get to, you could say, the quote unquote the benefits of a long-term relationship. But you don't, like, you can't. This is maybe, I don't know if this is inappropriate as an example, but think of like the Hard Rock Casino or the Hard Rock Hotel. If you skip out on the foundation, it's gonna collapse, right? At some point, it's gonna collapse. And so if your foundation is the hookup, if that's what's at the very rock bottom of your relationship, well, at some point that's gonna fade, right? At some point it's gonna not be as intense, or maybe there'll be a tough day, and you go to lean on like what you truly share in common, or this this shared vision of virtue and goodness, and it's not there, right? Your foundation was the hookup. Their foundation was the romantic feeling, the emotional feeling. Well, then the relationship collapses, right? But if you make your foundation strong, you make it sturdy, right? If you build it up over time slowly on things that really matter, right? A shared vision of what is good and true and beautiful in life. A foundation built on loving God, loving your family, loving your friends. If that's what the foundation of your relationship is, and something happens, let's say a tragedy of some sort, or just even a fight, and you can rely on that as your foundation rather than the hookup emotions, well, then your relationship has a much greater chance at surviving. And at the same time, right, the romance actually means a lot more, because it's not just a fleeting romantic desire, right? It's true, genuine love. And so, to get back to our original point, the church isn't saying that premarital sex is bad because sex is bad. The church is saying premarital sex, like any extramarital affairs, right? Whether you're married, anything that's not within the confines of marriage, is bad because the marital love is so good. And you don't want to risk that for something cheaper, for something that's the foundation's not going to be strong, something that's not going to help you have a successful and happy and good marriage. So you always want to make that argument from the pro side. You want to be running towards something, not running away from something, right? You want to be running towards the things that build up a good marriage, not running from fear of punishment or things like that. Okay, so that's enough for today. I think that's a lot there to think about. We'll have a few end questions for today. Don't forget to do the journal if you haven't done it. And we'll have one more class day before we head off for Easter break. And, we'll talk more about Easter tomorrow. Hopefully the Saints win tonight, because I'm recording this on Monday. But other than that, guys, I will see you in the next one.